These poisons were never locked away. They sat on drugstore shelves, in paint sets, in the office tea trolley, a brush tipped between two fingers, painted with something that glowed green in the dark and was called harmless. One is still measured into pills today to steady failing hearts. One ended when a signal beat the killer across the ocean. The Tylenol Capsules. 8 bottles of Tylenol sat on drugstore shelves around Chicago in the fall of 1982, and inside them, someone had replaced dozens of capsules with cyanide. At the time, sealed packaging meant nothing more than a fresh box. No one checked for tampering because no one had ever needed to. Cyanide works by shutting down a switch every cell needs to burn oxygen for fuel, the way turning off the gas to a stove leaves the burner looking normal while nothing inside it can light. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman took 1 capsule for a cold on a September morning in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, and was dead by daybreak. 6 more people across the Chicago area died the same way over the next 3 days, all from bottles bought at different stores. The killer was never identified, and the case remains open to this day. What changed was everything downstream of it. Within weeks, federal regulators required tamper-evident seals on every over-the-counter medicine bottle in the country. And within a year, Congress made tampering itself a federal crime. The click-open safety cap that people still peel back every morning exists because of that autumn in Illinois. The Hatter's Shake. In Danbury, Connecticut, every hatter in town knew the trembling hands and the slurred speech were just part of the trade. Felt hats were cured with a mercury nitrate solution, a process workers called carroting, and the fumes filled poorly ventilated workshops for hours at a stretch. Mercury vapor collects in the nervous system a little at a time, the way a dripping faucet slowly fills a tub no one is watching, until one day the water reaches the rim. One hat finisher in his 30s began losing his balance on the shop floor so often that his coworkers had a name for it before any doctor did: the Danbury Shakes. Memory slipped next. Then his hands would not hold a brush steady enough to finish a brim, and he was let go from a trade he had worked since he was a boy. The phrase outlived the disease. "Mad as a hatter" became a common expression on both sides of the Atlantic, repeated for generations by people who had no idea it described a real, documented industrial poisoning. The hat companies, for their part, simply paid a small wage premium for what they openly called a dangerous job, and called that fair. The Flypaper Wife.
Florence Maybrick soaked sheets of ordinary flypaper in a bowl of water in her bedroom in Liverpool and told the housemaid it was for her complexion, since diluted arsenic was a known, if quiet, beauty remedy in 1889. Arsenic was sold openly in dozens of household products, and flypaper was one of the cheapest sources of it in any home. The poison works by choking off the furnace inside every cell, the tiny structures that burn sugar for energy. The way shoveling sand into a boiler eventually smothers the fire no matter how much coal is added on top. Her husband, a Liverpool cotton merchant, grew steadily sicker over weeks, and after his death, arsenic turned up in his body along with evidence of Florence's flypaper soaking. She was convicted and sentenced to hang, a sentence commuted to life in prison after public doubt over the medical evidence, and she was released in 1904 after 15 years. Historians still argue over how much of the arsenic actually came from her, because her husband was already known to dose himself with arsenic as a personal tonic, a fashionable habit at the time, long before he ever fell sick. That same detail, buried in the trial record, was enough to leave doubt hanging over a verdict that had already sent her to the gallows. The Lambeth Poisoner. In 1891, a London physician named Thomas Neal Cream began mailing pills to women who had never asked him for medicine, telling them the capsules would help with what doctors of the era vaguely called female troubles. The pills contained strychnine, a poison that locks the nervous system wide open instead of calming it. Nerves fire a signal and then need a separate signal to stop, and strychnine jams that second switch, so every muscle in the body contracts at once and will not let go, similar to a gas pedal stuck flat to the floor with no way to lift it. Matilda Clover, 27, took Cream's pills in her Lambeth lodging one evening and did not survive the night, after hours of convulsions so severe that a doctor at first blamed her drinking. Cream could not stop talking about his own crimes. He wrote to the police accusing 2 innocent doctors of Clover's murder, and in doing so let slip details of her death that had never been made public, since her case had quietly been filed as death by natural causes. That single detail told investigators the anonymous accuser was the killer himself. Cream was arrested, tried, and hanged in 1892.
undone less by any evidence he left at the scene than by his own compulsion to keep writing. The Radium Girls. The paintbrush was small enough to hold between 2 fingers, and the young women at the factory in Orange, New Jersey, were taught to bring it to a fine point with their lips before dipping it in radium paint to letter watch dials, since the paint glowed a soft green in the dark, and their employer told them it was harmless. Radium sits in the same column of the periodic table as calcium, close enough that the body cannot tell the difference, so it gets filed into the bones the same way calcium from a glass of milk would be, except radium never leaves, and keeps giving off radiation from the inside, like a nightlight that was never built with an off switch. Grace Fryer worked at the factory as a teenager, and years later her jaw began to crumble, and her bones fractured under almost no pressure at all, while doctors struggled to explain why a healthy young woman's skeleton was falling apart from within.
She sued the company in 1927, in a case that dragged on so long she had to be carried into the courtroom. And in 1928, she and 4 co-workers won a settlement with Medical Care for Life. Their case became the legal foundation that let American workers sue employers for occupational disease, a right that barely existed before their names were on a court docket. The Teacup Poisoner. Co-workers at a photographic supply company north of London trusted the tea trolley without a second thought, because Graham Young poured from the same pot everyone else drank from, and no one had reason to suspect the mild-mannered storeroom clerk who had only just been hired in 1971. Thallium has almost no taste and no smell, and it slips into nerve cells by mimicking potassium, the mineral those cells actually need to fire correctly. Similar to swapping in a battery that looks the exact right size but sends no real charge through the circuit.
Bob Eagle, a co-worker in his 50s, grew weak over months, his hands and feet going numb before his hair began falling out in clumps, and he died in the hospital with doctors unable to name a cause. What made the case land harder than most was that Young had already been convicted once, years earlier, for poisoning members of his own family with thallium as a teenager, then released from psychiatric custody as recovered. The same system meant to prevent exactly this had returned him to a workplace with a tea trolley, and no one told to watch him. The night shift nurse. It was sold as medicine that could steady a heart on the edge of failing. In the wrong hands, on a hospital night shift in New Jersey and Pennsylvania through the 1990s and into 2003, it stopped hearts instead.
Digoxin comes from the foxglove plant and is still prescribed today in small, controlled doses to keep an irregular heartbeat in rhythm, the same way a metronome keeps a band from drifting off tempo. Charles Cullen worked as a registered nurse across 9 hospitals over 16 years and used digoxin, among a handful of other drugs, to push patients into cardiac arrest, ordering the medication under names that did not match the people who actually received it. By late 2003, Reverend Florian Gall, a patient recovering under Cullen's care, was found with a dangerous level of digoxin in his system and died soon after. One of 2 cases that finally led detectives to Cullen's door. He was arrested that December and eventually pleaded guilty to 29 murders across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, though investigators believe the real number was far higher across his career. He was sentenced in 2006 to 11 consecutive life terms, and the same drug he weaponized still sits in hospital medication carts every day, measured out in doses too small to do what he did with it. The man who breathed it. In 1924, an engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr. stood in front of a room of reporters and poured over his own hands the gasoline additive he had invented, tetraethyl lead. It stopped car engines from knocking, and it worked on the body much like radium worked on bone, since lead can slide into the body's calcium pathways and jam the wiring of the nervous system, the way static overwhelms a radio signal until nothing comes through clearly. Workers at the plants producing the additive had already been dying or falling into fits of hallucination and violent insanity by the time Midgley held a bottle of it under his own nose, breathed the vapor for a full minute, and told the room he could do that every day without harm. He knew better. He had already spent months recovering from his own case of lead poisoning the year before. The company kept selling leaded gasoline at every filling station in the country for another 5 decades.
He never publicly reversed what he had told reporters that day, and he went on to invent another chemical compound, later tied to a different kind of global damage. Years afterward, disabled by a later illness, he built himself a pulley system to help him move around his own bedroom, and it was that same device, his own invention, that ended up killing him. The Unsolved Cup. Charles Bravo collapsed in agony inside his own townhouse in Balham, South London, in 1876, hours after a glass of water that his household staff said tasted faintly bitter. Antimony, in the form of tartar emetic, had been used by doctors for generations to induce vomiting in small, measured amounts, but in a large enough dose, it burns through the lining of the stomach and gut from the inside, the way a strong cleaning solution left on skin far past the time it should have been rinsed off will blister and scar.
Bravo lingered in extreme pain for 3 days before he died, with several people in the house, including his wife and a former physician of hers, all under suspicion at one point or another. 2 separate inquests were held, and each one ended without a single person being charged, despite investigators being fairly certain the poisoning was deliberate rather than accidental. Everyone in that house had spent years guarding a respectable reputation, and in the end, that same respectability was exactly what kept the truth sealed inside it. No confession, no trial, and no conviction ever followed. And the case is still listed as officially unsolved. The wireless capture. A telegram crossed the Atlantic days before the ship carrying Dr. Holly Crippen ever reached Canada. Cora Crippen had disappeared from their home in Holloway, London in early 1910, and her husband told neighbors and friends only that she had gone to America and died there suddenly. Hyoscine, also called scopolamine, works across the entire body at once, blocking the signals nerves send to muscles, similar to cutting the wires running into a house's phone line, so the receiver still looks perfectly normal while nothing gets through it anymore. Dr. Holly Crippen had bought hyoscine from a chemist shop days before his wife vanished, and her remains were later found buried beneath the cellar floor of their home. Crippen fled across the Atlantic aboard a steamship with his mistress disguised as a boy, believing he had left no way for anyone to reach him before landing. But the ship's captain recognized the pair and used the vessel's wireless telegraph, brand new technology at the time, to alert Scotland Yard while they were still at sea. An inspector boarded a faster ship, crossed the ocean ahead of them, and was waiting on the dock in Canada when Crippen's ship finally arrived. It was the first time in history a wireless signal had helped capture a fleeing criminal, and Crippen was hanged for the murder later that year. Which of these would you never have guessed sat on an ordinary shelf? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for the next one.